Somewhere around 5,000 years ago, a group of people buried their dead with garlic. Not gold, not weapons, garlic. And that wasn't a strange thing to do. That was completely normal. Because at the time, garlic wasn't just food. It was medicine, it was currency, it was power, and depending on who you asked, it was the difference between life and death. This is the story of how a small, pungent bulb, grown in the wild mountains of Central Asia, became one of the most important plants in human history. Most people know garlic as something you throw in a pan on a Tuesday night, but the full story is something else entirely. We're going to go from ancient Egypt to the Roman legions, through the Black Death, into the laboratories of modern science, and by the end of this, you'll understand why civilizations didn't just eat garlic, they built themselves around it. And the last chapter of this story, the one about what modern science actually confirmed, is the one that reframes everything that came before it. Let's start at the beginning. The wild ancestor of garlic, a plant called Allium longicuspis, grew across the rocky slopes of Central Asia, what's now Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and northwestern China. Nobody planted it, nobody cultivated it. It just grew there, and at some point, probably around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, people started eating it. Not because it tasted great raw, it doesn't, but because they noticed something. Animals that grazed near it seemed healthier. People who ate it seemed to recover faster. It had a smell so strong it felt like it was doing something. And in a world where you had no antibiotics, no hospitals, no germ theory, something that felt like it was doing something was enormously valuable. From Central Asia, garlic spread in two directions: west toward Mesopotamia and Egypt, and east toward India and China. Both of those paths led to something remarkable, and they happened almost simultaneously. In Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq, clay tablets from around 3000 BCE reference garlic as a food and a treatment. The Sumerians, who were among the first people to develop writing, thought it was worth writing down. That alone tells you how important it was. When a civilization decides something is worth carving into clay, it's not because they're indifferent to it, but it's Egypt where the story really gets interesting and where the first major open loop in garlic's history appears. Because the Egyptians didn't just use garlic, they used it in a way that no other civilization had attempted before, at a scale that still feels almost unbelievable when you read about it. The Great Pyramid of Giza. Around 2560 BCE, tens of thousands of workers moving limestone blocks that weighed up to 80 tons in the desert heat for years. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing about 2,000 years after the pyramid was built, claimed that inscriptions on the pyramid itself recorded the amount of garlic, onions, and radishes fed to the workers. Modern archaeologists have debated the translation, but the core idea is supported by other evidence. Worker villages excavated near Giza show large quantities of garlic remains. The Egyptian state was rationing garlic to its labor force, not as a luxury, as a necessity. Why? Because garlic kept people working. It reduced fatigue, it fought infection in a worksite where open wounds were constant and deadly, and it gave workers enough energy and stamina to keep going in conditions that would otherwise have been unsurvivable. The Egyptians had figured out, through thousands of years of observation, that garlic was doing something real. They didn't know what, but they knew it worked. And here's where it gets layered, because the Egyptians also used garlic in a completely different context: burial. Garlic bulbs were found in the tomb of Tutankhamun, the young pharaoh who died around 1323 BCE. They were found in other tombs too. The Egyptians believed garlic had protective power in the afterlife. So the same plant that kept pyramid workers alive was also being sent with kings into death. That's a remarkable dual role for one ingredient: sustainer of the living and guardian of the dead at the same time. Meanwhile, in India, the ancient Ayurvedic medical texts, some of the oldest medical literature in the world, were documenting garlic as a treatment for heart disease, digestive problems, infections, and respiratory conditions. The Charaka Samhita, one of the foundational texts of Ayurvedic medicine, written around the 4th century BCE, describes garlic in clinical terms: not as folk magic, as medicine, with dosages and applications and contraindications. Indian physicians were treating garlic the way a modern doctor treats a drug, with precision and intentionality. In China, the story is similar. The Yellow Emperor's Classic of Medicine, which dates to roughly the same period, references garlic as a treatment for multiple conditions. Chinese physicians used it for respiratory infections, digestive issues, and as an anti-parasitic. The Chinese, the Indians, and the Egyptians had arrived at roughly the same conclusions about garlic without ever comparing notes. That kind of independent convergence is one of the strongest signals in history that something is actually working. Now here's the thing about garlic's spread westward into the Mediterranean world, because this is where it hits its first major cultural friction and where the story takes a turn that most people don't know about. The Greeks had a complicated relationship with garlic. On one hand, Greek athletes ate it before competing in the Olympic Games. They believed it enhanced physical performance, and they were probably right. On the other hand, Greek aristocratic society considered garlic low class. There's a record of a Greek law that barred anyone who had eaten garlic from entering certain temples. The smell made you unworthy of the gods. So you had this bizarre split. Garlic was good enough for your athletes, but not good enough for your gods. It was medicine for the body and pollution for the spirit. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, writing around 400 BCE, had no such ambivalence. He prescribed garlic for pulmonary conditions, for abdominal growths, for infections, and as a general tonic. His famous phrase, often paraphrased as "let food be thy medicine," was very much in the spirit of how he approached garlic. He saw it as a tool, and he used it. But it was the Romans who took garlic and industrialized it. The Roman military machine ran in part on garlic. Roman soldiers were given garlic rations as standard issue. They planted it in every territory they conquered, so the supply chain would follow the legions. Dioscorides, a Greek physician serving in the Roman army in the 1st century CE, wrote extensively about garlic's medicinal properties in his work De Materia Medica, which became the foundational pharmacological reference in Europe and the Middle East for over 5,500 years. He described garlic as a treatment for intestinal parasites, respiratory infections, and snake bites. Whether or not it worked for snake bites is debatable. The intestinal parasite thing, modern science has since confirmed. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, writing around 77 CE, listed garlic as a treatment for 61 different ailments. 61, that's not a spice, that's a pharmacy in a bulb. And Pliny wasn't writing fiction, he was compiling the accumulated medical knowledge of the ancient world, and garlic showed up more than almost anything else. So by the time the Roman Empire reached its peak, garlic had been in continuous medical and culinary use for at least 4,000 years across 4 major civilizations, and the Romans spread it everywhere they went: Britain, France, Germany, North Africa, the Middle East. The legions planted garlic, and garlic stayed. Then Rome fell, and garlic's story in Europe got strange. The medieval period in Europe, roughly 500 CE to 1400 CE, was a time when ancient medical knowledge was partially preserved and partially lost. The Catholic Church controlled much of intellectual life, and garlic occupied an odd space. Monasteries, which were the primary centers of medical knowledge in early medieval Europe, grew garlic in their herb gardens and used it medicinally. Monks were essentially the doctors of the era, and they trusted garlic the way Hippocrates had. So in that context, garlic was respectable. But in popular culture, garlic started accumulating a different kind of reputation. The strong smell, the way it lingered on the breath and skin, the fact that it was associated with peasants and the poor, all of that fed into a growing folk mythology. Garlic became associated with warding off evil, vampires, demons, the evil eye. The protective power the Egyptians had assigned to it in the afterlife had mutated into something more superstitious in medieval Europe. People hung garlic over doorways, wore it around their necks, rubbed it on their children. The medicine had become magic. And then came 1347, the Black Death. The bubonic plague arrived in Europe through Sicilian ports, carried by fleas on rats aboard trading ships from Central Asia. Within 4 years, it had killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. Somewhere between 25 and 50 million people dead, in a continent that had no idea what was causing it and no tools to stop it. It was the most catastrophic event in European history, and it happened fast, faster than any war, faster than any famine. In the chaos, people reached for everything they had, and garlic was one of the first things they reached for. There are documented accounts of physicians during the plague years wearing garlic inside their famous beak-shaped masks, those leather masks you've probably seen in images with the long pointed nose. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs and frequently garlic. The theory at the time was that the plague was spread by bad air, what they called miasma. If you filled your breathing space with a strong enough smell, the thinking went, you might block out the bad air. They were wrong about the mechanism. But here's the part that's genuinely fascinating. There are also accounts of people who consumed large amounts of garlic during the plague, surviving at higher rates than those who didn't. A story that circulated widely in medieval Europe and has been documented in various forms by historians describes 4 thieves in France who robbed the homes of plague victims without contracting the disease. When caught and questioned, they reportedly revealed they had been drinking a vinegar infusion heavily laced with garlic and other herbs. The recipe became known as 4 Thieves vinegar, and versions of it were used as a protective tonic across Europe for centuries. Was it the garlic? Possibly, in part. Garlic has genuine antimicrobial properties. Modern science has confirmed this, and I'll get to exactly what that confirmation looks like in a moment. But the plague was bacterial, spread by fleas, and no amount of garlic was going to stop Yersinia pestis once it was in your bloodstream. What garlic might have done was reduce secondary infections, support immune function, and possibly deter the fleas themselves, since the strong sulfur compounds in garlic are known insect repellents. So the people eating garlic during the Black Death weren't crazy. They were working with the best tool available to them, and it may have helped more than they realized. By the time Europe emerged from the medieval period and entered the Renaissance, garlic had traveled a long road. It had been a pyramid ration, a royal burial offering, an Olympic performance enhancer, a military staple, a monastic medicine, a plague remedy, and a vampire repellent. And it hadn't slowed down. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as European powers began colonizing the Americas, garlic went with them. Spanish and Portuguese colonizers brought it to South America, where it mixed with indigenous culinary traditions and spread rapidly. It went to the Caribbean, to Mexico, to what would eventually become the United States. At the same time, trade routes were carrying garlic deeper into Southeast Asia, where it became embedded in the cuisines of Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. By 1700, garlic was being grown and eaten on every inhabited continent. No other plant had traveled that far, that fast, and embedded itself that deeply into that many different cultures simultaneously. And through all of that, the medical claims kept accumulating. Every culture that adopted garlic also adopted a version of the belief that it was doing something for the body. The specifics varied, heart health here, digestion there, infection elsewhere, but the core conviction was consistent. Garlic was medicine. The question that nobody could answer until the 20th century was, why? That's the open loop that's been running through this entire story, and it's time to close it. Because the science, when it finally arrived, was more interesting than anyone expected. In 1944, a chemist named Chester Cavalito, working at a pharmaceutical laboratory in the United States, isolated the compound responsible for garlic's antimicrobial activity. He called it allicin, and allicin turned out to be remarkable. When you crush or chew a garlic clove, you break open its cells and trigger a chemical reaction. An enzyme called allicin converts a compound called allicin into allicin, which is the active ingredient. It doesn't exist in the garlic until you damage it. The plant produces it as a defense mechanism, and once it's produced, Allicin is one of the most potent naturally occurring antimicrobial compounds ever identified. Cavallito's research showed that allicin was effective against a wide range of bacteria, including Staphylococcus and Streptococcus, the same organisms responsible for the infections that killed people in ancient worksites, medieval battlefields, and plague-era Europe. The monks who grew garlic in their monastery gardens and the Egyptian administrators who rationed it to pyramid workers had been right. They just hadn't known why. But allicin was only the beginning. Over the following decades, researchers identified dozens of other sulfur compounds in garlic: diallyl disulfide, diallyl trisulfide, azuine, each with their own biological activity. And the research directions these compounds opened up were significant. Studies on garlic and cardiovascular health have accumulated steadily since the 1970s. A meta-analysis published in the Journal of Nutrition found that garlic supplementation produced meaningful reductions in both systolic and diastolic blood pressure in people with hypertension. A separate body of research showed that garlic compounds reduce LDL cholesterol and inhibit platelet aggregation, meaning they make the blood less likely to clot in dangerous ways. The ancient claim that garlic was good for the heart, which appears in Ayurvedic texts from 2,400 years ago, has held up under controlled clinical conditions. That's not nothing. That's a 2,400-year-old hypothesis being confirmed by modern science. The immune function research is similarly compelling. A randomized controlled trial published in the journal Advances in Therapy followed 146 participants over 12 weeks. The group taking a garlic supplement had significantly fewer colds than the placebo group, and when they did get sick, they recovered faster. The mechanism appears to involve garlic's ability to stimulate the production of white blood cells and enhance the activity of natural killer cells, the immune system's frontline responders. There's also emerging research on garlic and cancer prevention, though this area is more nuanced and less conclusive. Population studies have shown that people who consume large amounts of garlic and other allium vegetables have lower rates of certain cancers, particularly stomach and colorectal cancer. The proposed mechanisms involve allicin and its derivatives interfering with the cell cycle and promoting apoptosis, programmed cell death, in cancerous cells. This research is ongoing and hasn't produced clinical recommendations yet, but the signal is there and it's being taken seriously. And then there's the antibiotic resistance angle, which might be the most urgent application of all. We are living through a slow-motion crisis in which many of the bacterial infections that modern medicine has controlled for 80 years are becoming resistant to our existing antibiotics. Researchers are actively looking for new antimicrobial compounds, and allicin has attracted serious attention because it operates through a different mechanism than most antibiotics, one that bacteria appear to have a harder time developing resistance to. A study from the University of Copenhagen published in 2012 found that azuine, one of garlic's sulfur compounds, was effective at disrupting the communication system that bacteria use to coordinate their defenses. That system is called quorum sensing, and disrupting it is one of the most promising strategies in the fight against antibiotic-resistant infections. Garlic, the thing humans have been using for 7,000 years, might be part of the answer to one of the most pressing medical challenges of the 21st century. If you're finding this as fascinating as I do, there's a lot more where this came from. We've done deep dives into the histories of other foods and spices that changed the world: pepper, salt, sugar, chocolate, and each one has a story just as layered as this one. Those videos are worth your time. And if you want to make sure you don't miss what's coming next, subscribing takes about 2 seconds and it actually makes a difference for the channel. Drop a comment below too. I'm genuinely curious which part of garlic's history surprised you most. The pyramid ration thing, the plague thieves, the antibiotic resistance research? Let me know. So let's bring this full circle, because the story of garlic is really the story of human observation. For 7,000 years, across dozens of civilizations, on every continent, people watched garlic do something and they kept using it. They didn't know about allicin. They didn't know about allicin or quorum sensing or natural killer cells. They just noticed that the people who ate it seemed to do better, and they passed that observation forward, generation after generation, embedded in their food and their medicine and their burial rituals and their military rations. The Egyptians who packed garlic into Tutankhamun's tomb were doing the same thing as the Roman army doctor who prescribed it for intestinal parasites, who was doing the same thing as the medieval monk who grew it in his herb garden, who was doing the same thing as the 20th century chemist who finally figured out why it worked. They were all responding to the same signal, just with different tools for understanding it. Garlic started as a wild plant on a rocky mountainside in Central Asia. It became a pyramid ration, a royal burial offering, a military staple, a plague remedy, and now a subject of serious pharmaceutical research. It fed the people who built the ancient world. It traveled with every empire and every trade route. It embedded itself into the food cultures of every civilization that encountered it. And it did all of that because it actually works. The next time you crush a garlic clove and that sharp sulfurous smell hits you, that smell is allicin being created in real time, the same chemical reaction that the Egyptians were triggering 5,000 years ago when they handed garlic to the workers building the pyramids. You're connected to all of that every time you cook with it. That's the history of garlic, and honestly, it deserved to be told.